Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our briefing, How Can We Cut Industrial Emissions? I'm Dan Brissett. I'm the president of the Environmental and Energy Study Institute, and we're coming to you via the live cast only today because of the ongoing lapse in appropriations. So thank you very much for hanging in there with us and joining us online. EESI was founded by a bipartisan group of members of Congress, and since 1984, we have provided information about the broadest possible range of environmental, energy, and climate change topics to policymakers and the public. We do our best to ensure that our resources are timely, relevant, accessible, and practical. We put a lot of thought into making sure our resources are always science-based and ready when congressional staff need the information, or even better, before they realize they need the information. If you'd like to keep up, if you're new to EESI and you'd like to keep up with everything that we do, the best way to do that is to subscribe to our biweekly newsletter, Climate Change Solutions. You can also follow us on Blue Sky and Instagram, and we'll make sure that you never miss any of our briefings and other resources. We do a lot of briefings. Sometimes they're online like this, sometimes they're in person on Capitol Hill. But the idea is that we bring experts and practitioners and leaders to a policymaker audience to help them understand these issues. Next up on October 30th, which is next Thursday, will be the latest of our rapid readout lunchtime briefings. These are shorter format, 30-ish minutes, where we'll just have one panelist and we'll just talk through one thing with some depth. We'll be taking stock of federal disaster policy, reform efforts, and look at where things stand in general with FEMA. Then we will shift gears into our very intense coverage of the international climate negotiations set to happen in Brazil in November. We will host 3 online-only briefings on successive days starting November 4th. One briefing will be about the negotiations and possible outcomes. One briefing will be about the global cooling pledge, and one briefing will be about international trade and climate policy. You're not going to want to miss any of those briefings. They'll help you answer questions from your boss about what's happening at COP30, even without an official US administration presence there. We have a lot of other amazing COP resources as well. We have trackers. We have a daily newsletter called COP Dispatch. We'll do staff-only update opportunities as well with folks on the ground. So again, subscribe to Climate Change Solutions or reach out to me or any of my colleagues if you'd like to learn more and get engaged with our work. COP is one of those things where if you don't work on it year round, it's something you only hear about in the news for a couple weeks, and your bosses will have questions about that. We can help you answer those questions and keep up with what we do. Everything is always available online at www.eesi.org. In a moment, we'll put a link up for a survey. We'll put this up at the end of the briefing as well. If you have a minute or two to fill out the survey and tell us how we did today, we'd really appreciate that. We'll also have time for questions. We have 3 incredible people coming up to talk to you all about industrial decarbonization. If you have a question for one of them, you can follow us on social media at EESI Online. We'll be doing real-time coverage on Blue Sky and Instagram. You can also send us an email, and the email address to use is ask, that's A-S-K, at eesi.org. We'll do our best to incorporate questions into the Q&A after our panel concludes. So the industrial sector is presently the second largest greenhouse gas emitter, representing about 30% of all US greenhouse gas emissions. And by 2035, the industrial sector will likely be the largest emitter. It takes a lot of energy to reach the high temperatures needed to make steel and cement, as well as chemicals and plastics. And to date, this has been mostly achieved by burning fossil fuels, which are, of course, the chief source of plenty of pollutants, including carbon dioxide that contributes to global warming. The size of the challenge of decarbonizing the industrial sector is being met by people like our panelists who are researching alternative technologies and techniques for industrial emissions reductions and then helping implement solutions. We'll learn about electrification, energy efficiency, material reuse, and other approaches. And as you can imagine, this is an area with real potential for partnerships between government and the private sector to deploy extremely cool innovations like green steel and carbon negative concrete. So we have 3 incredible panelists coming up. The first is Angela Anderson. Angela is Director of Industrial Innovation at the World Resources Institute. Angela leads WRI's work to decarbonize heavy industry, and they produce research and analysis evaluating key technical and policy questions, and they convene stakeholders to advance solutions primarily in refining chemicals, cement, and steel. Angela's career spans 3 decades in environmental protection as Director of the Climate and Energy Program at the Union of Concerned Scientists and International Climate Director at the U.S. Climate Action Network and the Pew Environmental Trust. She also founded Clear the Air, a national coalition to reduce pollution from power plants. Angela, it's always very nice to see you. I think this is your first appearance in an EESI briefing, so welcome to the show. turn it over to you. I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's great to be here. Nobody does briefings like EESI. You guys are the best. And this is a really important topic, and I'm really glad we're talking about it today. Reducing emissions from industrial sources, particularly from the most carbon intensive and trade exposed sectors in the economy, is incredibly important. And it's more possible to do so than ever before. So that's what I find exciting about working in this sector. And it really is a growing sector. I'm seeing more and more graduate programs in industrial modernization, decarbonization, et cetera. So this is really a field that is taking off, not just in a policy space, but technologically as well. Next slide, please. Daniel gave a nice summary of the state of global emissions in his intro, but I'll just reiterate here. Globally, the manufacturing, mining, construction, and waste processing are responsible for 21% of direct emissions globally. When you add in the indirect emissions, the energy, including the energy needed to power these facilities, it goes to 34%, so more than a third of global emissions. And this is from the Systems Change Lab. Next slide, please. This is showing the US and kind of illustrating that point that Dan made in the introduction. As you can see, refining and chemicals, and the process of making chemicals that are critical for plastics, fertilizers, cosmetics, all of those consumer products we're used to, are by far the highest emitting industrial sector. They accounted for over 27% of direct US emissions. But the building materials sector, cement, iron, and steel in particular, you'll see down below, are also significant drivers. So next slide, please. So why should we care about reducing emissions from industry? Well, traditionally, facilities like steel mills and other chemical plants, et cetera, have been responsible for some of the world's worst pollution. Soot and smog, toxic chemicals, and carbon pollution, which is contributing to the increase in global average temperatures. And that's been proven to intensify weather events like heat waves, hurricanes, and droughts, as well as impacting biodiversity and the spread of disease and sea level rise. The US has often led the way in pollution reduction measures. In the 70s, coal-powered energy and industry and lots of other things had created an environmental and health crisis. Poor air quality was making people sick. It was polluting lakes and rivers, what we called acid rain, and technology to clean up these industries was expensive. But the passage of the Clean Air Act and a host of other environmental policies kind of changed the calculation, and it created market mechanisms to help finance a transition to cleaner ways of manufacturing. Next slide, please. And now the move to tackle climate change is stimulating a similar global cleanup, focused now on carbon. The world has embarked on a global energy transition that will not be stopped because of a couple of election cycles in the US. The transition started in the 1990s, focusing on cleaner electricity and transportation, and is now reaching sectors and products in the economy that were often long considered hard to abate. These developments around the world, these commitments countries are making, and the investments they're making in cleaner industry are going to change the way US companies who operate internationally have to do business. Next slide, please. Today, I want to focus on four messages about industrial emissions. One is that the global drive toward lower carbon products, particularly building materials, is creating an opportunity for US companies to modernize and to deliver benefits to communities and the environment as they deliver cleaner products to global markets. The other important thing is that the technologies that are needed to do that are within reach, some more available to others. I think we've got, I think Kate's going to speak more to that in a moment. And it's going to take both public policy and private action to enable US companies to compete and win in the global market. And the last is that cleaner industry benefits people, nature, and climate. The benefits of reducing emissions, modernizing industrial production go far beyond climate. It can deliver cleaner air with fewer toxins that make people sick. Next slide. So I just wanted to give you a sense of where the global trends are in terms of carbon policy and policy around low carbon products. International action to reduce greenhouse gases is increasingly including emissions intensive industrial products like cement, steel, and chemicals, as we've talked about. Carbon tariffs work by levying fees on imports that exceed a set emissions intensity threshold, such as the tons of CO2 per ton of steel. The most prominent such measure of the carbon tariffs is the EU carbon border adjustment mechanism, which would levy a fee on carbon intensive imports based on the EU's carbon price. This is, of course, possible because the European Union put in place the EU ETS, the trading system for emission credits back in the 90s. But other countries have carbon policies that are currently domestic but could be expanded to include imports like carbon trading markets. China has an emissions trading system. Vietnam has a carbon market that'll soon cover domestic cement, steel, and aluminum. And 27 additional countries have carbon prices or taxes. So this is becoming a global trend. Next slide, please. Economically, too, and investment-wise, we're seeing global trends. This is from Bloomberg New Energy Finance, and it shows that global energy transition investment has surpassed $2 trillion for the first time. And it's more than doubled since 2020. That's just 5 years ago. The Asia Pacific, and most of that investment, as you might imagine, is in renewable energy, power grids, and electrified transportation. The Asia Pacific region grew the fastest, 21%, and mainland China's growth alone accounted for 2/3 of the global uptick, more than double of any other economy. U.S. investment was stable at around $338 billion, but the industrial decarbonization technologies that you see on the bottom of the slide, CCS, nuclear, energy storage, accounted for just 7.4% of total investment. So this is part of the challenge in scaling up the technologies that can decarbonize those hard to abate sectors. Next slide. So taking a closer look at the technologies and practices that can decarbonize industry, I think everybody on the panel is going to have something to say about these building blocks, but it sounds simple, but there is a somewhat limited menu with lots of variation in how you do this. The first one is to change change your fuels away from fossil fuels, as well as feedstocks that are moving away from feedstocks that are carbon intensive. The second is to capture the carbon either in the smokestack or during the combustion project. The other thing we could do is electrify a lot of the industrial processes, and energy efficiency is another measure that can just reduce the amount of energy needed and thus reduce emissions. And those things kind of all together, fuel switching, fuel and feedstock switching, capturing carbon, electrification, those are the real keys to doing that. And the key to fuel switching in the industrial sector is that you have to have a fuel in many cases that can produce very high temperatures. And so that's why we've been talking a lot about hydrogen, particularly clean hydrogen over the last few years, and what a critical technology it may be for some of these sectors. Next slide, please. So the U.S. has been investing in these technologies and in incentives that would encourage companies to adopt these technologies at scale, to pilot them and to adopt them at scale where possible. We've been operating mostly at the carrot end of the spectrum. And we think that there is still a reason to believe, given the global dynamics, that there's still room for bipartisan cooperation around these policies that are going to be essential to transforming this marketplace. And one area we might want to talk about a little bit is really the foundation of industrial policy, and that's data collection, transparency, and standards. Those really form the basis of any set of policies that are going to help transform the marketplace. And there's some evidence that there's some possibility around policies like that in this Congress. And finally, there's one last area we can make progress in. Next slide. I hope you'll take a look at the case study on our website of the Tallgrass project. The energy transition is going to mean a lot of new infrastructure, and companies are beginning to understand that the way to build support for their projects and avoid costly delays is to start working with the communities at the outset before they actually design and have the project pretty much ready to go. The key is to find some common ground and literally build on it. That's what they did in Nebraska. The Tallgrass project, the Tallgrass company, that pipeline company, negotiated with the community for landowner protections, public safety resources and commitments, and community investments. I saw the folks who negotiated this deal speak in public, and it was really kind of fascinating and one of those moments where you go, this is how things should be done, right? It just makes sense. So the energy transition's underway from Nebraska to Asia, and it could be an opportunity to modernize aging factories, reduce emissions, improve air quality, and bring prosperity to the U.S. So looking forward to participating in this transition and the discussion. Back to you, Dan.
Thanks, Angela. That was great. Angela, you had lots of great slides. Just as a reminder, everything from today, including the webcast, the slides, presentation materials, everything is available at eesi.org. So if you want to go back and revisit anything that you're hearing or look at any of the slides in more detail, you can absolutely do that. I'm glad Angela mentioned Bloomberg New Energy Finance or Bloomberg NEF. They are one of our usual suspects. We do a briefing with them in the Business Council for Sustainable Energy each spring about, it's called the Sustainable Energy in America Factbook. It's a great overview of all of this stuff. It goes far beyond the industrial sector. But if anyone is interested in a 101, what does the energy system in the United States look like, broadly defined, you really can't get much better than the Sustainable Energy in America Factbook. So I would encourage anyone to go back and check that out. And if there's questions in our online audience, we have lots of time to take those questions. Send us an email at ask, that's ask@eesi.org. Next up, we have Kate Scott Pavao. Kate is the founder of KLSP Consulting, where she advises clients across the energy ecosystem, including data center operators and universities, on advancing emerging technologies and industrial decarbonization strategies. Previously, Kate served at the United States Department of Energy, leading 2 pathway to commercial liftoff reports on industrial decarbonization and long-duration energy storage. You picked good topics. For the Office of Technology Transitions, she also worked on the Industrial Demonstrations Program, including leading DOE's investment in the first planned U.S. aluminum smelter since 1985. Earlier in her career, Kate was a consultant with Bain & Company and worked with the ad hoc group to advise climate tech startups on regulatory and go-to-market strategies. Kate, thanks for joining us this morning. Turn it over to you.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan and EESI, for having me. I'm really excited to share some of the insights from the Department of Energy and then actually update them really for what's going on in the market today. So yeah, I'll be talking about kind of the state of the technologies that we're seeing, the adoption of those technologies, and then some of the headwinds and tailwinds that have been affecting the way that we're cutting industrial emissions. So if we go to the next slide, a little bit of my background, why am I speaking to you today? I'm really passionate about getting technology out of the market, or out of the lab and into the market. I really view that as bringing 3 disciplines together. So a technology basis, a policy understanding, and then a commercial understanding. And that's really the set of experience that allowed me to come to the Department of Energy. I first started with our Office of Technology Commercialization, used to be called the Office of Technology Transitions. And that's where we led the Pathway to Commercial Liftoff reports, really focused on what are the technologies today and what is the market requiring and the challenges that we need to solve in order to really motivated by implementing the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Inflation Reduction Act. And then after that experience, I was part of the team implementing the Industrial Demonstrations Program. So this was a $6 billion program, $500 million from the BIL and $5.5 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act. And that was selected 33 projects and planning to bring about $14 billion of additional private sector funding alongside that federal investment. Would have also brought tens of thousands of jobs across the United States. We'll hear a little bit more about what we chose and where we are today in a bit. So the next slide, I'm coming to you now as I've left the Department of Energy and am the founder of my own consultancy, KLSP. So we're kickstarting commercial liftoff in science and policy. And as Dan said, working across a bunch of different clients on this topic. So next slide. We're going to see a couple figures from the liftoff report. And I wanted to start by just emphasizing these industrial facilities are all across the country, every state, many, many communities. So every facility has a fence line community to think of as well, typically really engaged with what that facility is bringing. A lot of folks working at that in that area. And this is just the facilities emitting at least 25,000 tons of CO2 a year. And you can think about that as for something like cement, it's about 1 ton of CO2 per 1 ton of cement material. So if that facility is making 25,000 tons of material, that's enough to pour the foundation of the newest skyscraper in Chicago, the St. Regis, 12 times in a year. So some of the sectors like aluminum, you're going to have more, that would be less material, some maybe a little bit more. But these are significant. There's additional tiny, smaller manufacturing or processing plants all across the nation. So if we go to the next slide, we can see an opportunity in every sector, as kind of Angela teed up, for technologies to be applied. So in this figure on the left side, we have the decarbonization levers, as Angela called them, the kind of ways we can address this. And on the top, we have the 8 sectors that were named in the Inflation Reduction Act that we focused on at the DOE. And so the dark green is what we're calling deployable. We're seeing these as commercially ready. They've been done at scale. And then the lighter green is in demonstration, the gray being a pilot or R&D phase. And so there are a number of levers like energy efficiency, raw material substitution, either recycling material or bringing a lower carbon input, that are readily deployable. And we're seeing them adopted throughout the United States, throughout the world. And then there are other levers that maybe there's a specific sector that they're really well done for. So for carbon capture and storage, in chemicals, certain facilities that have a higher purity or concentration of CO2, there's going to be more commercial opportunities to use those technologies. You can think natural gas processing or ethanol. And other areas, you're going to need demonstration funds to show how can we get these technologies to be more commercial. And we'll talk about that in a second. So we'll go to the next slide. So we say there's all these technologies that are ready, but why aren't we seeing them across every facility in the United States? And we thought about that at the Department of Energy in terms of adoption readiness. And so you can find this framework that the Office of Technology Commercialization developed in concert, or it's supposed to be in concert to technology readiness, still on the OTC's website. And the categories along the side are really how you can think about what could be stopping a technology from going, even if it's been demonstrated at scale, from being adopted more broadly. So the first is around the value proposition. So this is something that many folks will hear about. These technologies often have a higher delivered cost than the alternative, and they're either highly more complex to adopt or really just different, given the way these things have been done for decades, would look different in a new technology landscape. I will say we think about a lot of this as first of a kind cost. So the first time you build a technology, maybe you don't know exactly how the material is going to flow through your system, and you get a pipe that has too sharp of an angle, and so you have to re-engineer it to flow better. Those are the kinds of things that once you do it at scale, you get to not answer that question as expensively the next time. And so it was really important to see these first of a kind projects get developed, typically with some kind of catalytic or philanthropic or government funds. The next area is around resource maturity. So we heard a little bit about infrastructure and CO2 pipelines. We're seeing for a lot of these technologies, we don't have the infrastructure we need that can scale. So for hydrogen, you hear a lot, we could use it if it's readily available at our site at a cost. And that cost comes down a lot if you have a pipeline. A kind of proof of concept example is the pipelines in Texas have allowed a lot of CO2 capture facilities to be announced in that area, relying on sharing the infrastructure along the Gulf Coast to either sell CO2 captured or eventually store it in the large section available potentially in the Gulf. The other thing about resource maturity is capital flow challenges. We think about this as getting a technology ready for debt financing. So that's the lowest cost money you can get in the market, but it's our savings, right? It's what we put in the bank. And so if somebody is going to write a loan to a technology, they need to be certain that money is going to come back so that our monetary system stays healthy. And the way we get something ready for a bank to write a loan is to show it can be done many times and give them a lot of data. And we'll hear more about where the challenges are coming from, but really the pullback of federal funds here has definitely been a hit and a headwind in this area. So the rest of these, I'll go through a little bit faster. Market acceptance. When I wrote the liftoff report, this was really what I called limited. So I got to change it to be emerging demand maturity because we are seeing people demand a lower emissions industrial material. And so I'll talk more about some of the public announcements that have happened in the last year on that. License to operate, we hit on the community perception. People need to understand what's going in their backyard and feel comfortable that we've done our technical diligence on what could happen and how to mitigate it. And then it's worth identifying that there is a technology readiness barrier here. You don't have a ton of highly technology ready options that could be adopted. So you really only have one option. And so the more options we can get, the more competition we'll have in the marketplace, and we'll see potentially more adoption. So if we go to the next page, I want to talk about the capital flow challenges. So this is really what we're seeing as a new headwind. The industrial demonstrations program was one of a couple industrial focused programs alongside 40209 that was run out of our manufacturing and energy supply chain office, and 48C tax credits. Those also had industrial applications. 48C, we're not going to really know what the changes in projects are based on the headwinds, whereas 40209, there's projects being canceled on the latest announcements from DOE. For the industrial demos, though, we announced in early 2024 about 33 projects across these 8 sectors. And then earlier this year, the department announced the termination of about 2/3 of those projects. And so I've listed on the slide, we have 10 that are continuing, 2 in chemicals and refining, on CO2 utilization and syngas recycling in the Gulf, 2 on iron and steel, 1 making electrical steel at Cleveland Cliffs in Pennsylvania, 1 making iron briquettes with Vale in Louisiana, cement, making a new cement substitute in Virginia with Titan Americas. And then the one sector that was not changed in this announcement was the aluminum and metals sector. And so we're looking at Century Aluminum creating a new primary smelter, the project I worked on, somewhere along the Mississippi or Ohio River Valley. And then Constellium doing hydrogen in West Virginia, Real Alloy doing recycling in Indiana, and Golden Aluminum electrifying their heating processes in Colorado. And I should say Wheeland as well in Kentucky, recycling copper. So really ahead of its time in terms of the need for that material. There was also canceled projects across the country, the South, the Gulf Coast, the West, California and Arizona. New England, the Midwest. I mean, food and beverage, especially facilities are all across the country, especially the Midwest. They had multiple project sites, and those were all canceled and terminated. So that's the headwind. We really do need, and we're seeing some people step in. We'll hear from Abigail on opportunities to try and find new sources of capital, potentially, maybe in philanthropic dollars, to solve this. So we go to the last page, next page. This is where I'd see the tailwinds in the marketplace. So as the government is stepping back, there are partnerships with industry. The hyperscalers, these are the technology companies building out huge amounts of data centers that require these materials, nonprofits, and the industry players continuing. So on the left-hand side, you can see announcements for buyers alliances and a direct offtake agreement between technology companies and low-carbon cement producers and building material producers. This actually, one of the deals is with a former industrial demonstration program recipient. So we're still seeing demand from the marketplace for the projects and for that material. On the right-hand side, we have philanthropics working together with industry to actually underwrite and create insurance products with philanthropic dollars for first-of-a-kind projects. So a much smaller scale, but still focused on the same issue that the DOE was thinking about. And then we have Apple hitting their environmental goals, really focusing on recycling and thinking about the end of life for their products. So these are the positives. I'll hand it back over to Dan. Really appreciate the opportunity to share that.
Thanks, Kate. That was a great presentation. And we, just as a mention, we had the Jerry Richmond, formerly the Undersecretary for Science and Innovation, on our podcast last season, talking about sort of how some of this work is continuing as well. So if you're not, folks in the audience want to go back and listen to what Jerry had to say, she's amazing. And she also talked a lot about mentorship and how she, encourages women to enter policy and STEM fields, and she a great podcast guest. We also, as you were talking, we also did a briefing as part of our Congressional Climate Camp series earlier this year about clean manufacturing. And we had company Daikin US talking about their manufacturing facilities in the southern part of the country, and we had a lot of great discussion about different technologies. And there's some overlap between the technologies you presented on that slide with the green boxes and some of those. That brings us to our third panelist. Abigail Regitsky is a program director at Blue Horizons Foundation. Abigail leads industrial sector efforts there, focusing on decarbonization through the lenses of clean energy abundance and affordability, deployment-led innovation, and global technology diffusion. Prior to Blue Horizons, Abigail worked at Breakthrough Energy, where she helped implement their climate policy priorities, including industrial decarbonization, embodied carbon in buildings and construction, climate and trade, and carbon management. And she worked on Capitol Hill as a professional staff person for the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and for Senator Tina Smith of Minnesota, which is, I think, where we first met. Abigail, thank you so much for joining us today. I'm really looking forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan and EESI, for having me today. I think Angela and Kate really covered a lot, so we'll see if I can maybe go through my presentation a bit quickly and get to some of the Q&A. So we can go ahead and jump into the next slide. Here is just, again, I think Angela and Kate kind of covered a lot of this, but just a reframing, the materials that industry is making are really essential to our everyday lives, to be able to continue to build the things that we need for the clean energy transition, and maybe kind of most importantly, for further infrastructure development in emerging economies. And so while we can certainly buy project or buy certain products, shouldn't be as efficient as we can in the design, use as few as materials as we can. Ultimately, the world is going to need more of these materials, not less, and we're going to be building more of these factories. And so the problem we're trying to solve is really, if we know we need more of this stuff, we want it to be abundant and affordable, then how do we do that and also make sure it's clean? And I think that's really what we're all, trying to cover today. Here is just a quick graph to show from Rhodium Group on just by sector, the kind of projected growth of emissions from these different industries. I like this because it actually goes to 2100 instead of just 2050. So you can actually see like the even bigger uptick post 2050, if we don't try to figure this out sooner rather than later. And that's really, covered by that kind of development of emerging economies and the infrastructure that they're really going to need to build, and they should be building to, lift their citizens out of poverty. So that's, what we're trying to solve for here. And as Kate and Angela also spoke to, a lot of the technologies that we need to make sure this is clean right now, there are some that are kind of commercial. Maybe there's some adoption issues, but a lot of things also just aren't commercial yet. They're just not ready. And so we really need to focus on supporting continued innovation from early R&D all the way to early adoption, because we want to make these technologies as cheap as possible, so they can be deployed anywhere in the world. And we also want to work on how do we specifically move the technologies that might be innovated here in the US or in other OECD countries to non-OECD countries that are actually the ones that are going to need these technologies the most for their development. So that's something that we think about a lot at Blue Horizons. And then I think Angela touched on this as well. If we do this well, not only are we going to be using US-born industrial innovations to lead emissions reductions worldwide, but we can also make America more competitive, resilient, and secure in this kind of new geopolitical world that's increasingly going to be dominated by who's going to control the supply of clean energy and the supply chains for clean energy generation and use. And so I think what we're all trying to show here is this can be like a win-win-win, situation for everybody if we tackle this problem seriously. Next slide, please. So that's a bit of the framing of the problem. How I think about the solution, again, I think this has kind of also been covered a bit by the panelists, but if the goal is abundant, affordable, and clean, and we need innovation to get there, and that costs a lot of money because a lot of these technologies have a long way to go, and the government has limited resources, then, how do we get there? And ultimately, it is companies who are producing these goods, whether it's incumbents who have been doing this for, decades, really, creating the cement and steel that we've been using to build our societies, or it's startups who have a new idea. They're all companies, and so they have, a profit motivation. And so how can we think about using levers to really encouraging investments with that kind of mindset, really aligning with what they're trying to do as companies? So these are kind of three buckets that I can think of. I'm sure you can kind of cut these a lot of different ways, but just to simplify, one bucket of a lever is incentivizing supply. And, some examples that, the government has done in the past is doing now things like the programs that Kate spoke to, and, providing grants so that it is cheaper for the company to make those clean investments. And so really trying to increase the amount of clean products out there. Then you could also create demand. On the other hand, using tools like procurement. The government actually procures, say quite a bit of things like cement and concrete for, public funded infrastructure. So that's actually quite a, powerful market mechanism that the government has. And companies like the hyperscalers that Kate mentioned, also have this potential, demand pull mechanism. And the problem here is that because the technologies are still pretty early, there is usually a green premium. There's a cost to the cleaner good. And so it kind of requires somebody who can afford to pay more to initially buy some of the cleaner things. And then hopefully as things are developed and commercialized, that cost will come down, and then it becomes more affordable for everybody. And then there's, also the stick that Angela mentioned, kind of you're getting more to the regulation side, where, a government could just say, well, here's, an emissions limit. This is what you have to meet. If you don't meet it, you pay a fine. There are other consequences. And so there's, a wide range of buckets there. But I think what we want to think about is how these different levers are going to impact more of the kind of abundance and affordability pieces, because we really don't want to sacrifice those two aspects as we're trying to get to clean. And also how these align with companies' motives or not on profits. For example, if you're regulating too early or too strictly, that might increase costs or constrain supply or cause, unwanted closures of facilities, as Kate showed, that are, all across the state and really, are adding economic benefits, jobs to the communities they're in. And so how can we help companies clean up these facilities for, everyone's benefit, while being able to still create the goods that everybody depends on every day and will continue to depend on in the future. I think this will, require some collaboration, some government, civil society, private sector actors to kind of pull different levers simultaneously to kind of get this going. And as Angela also mentioned, the data piece is also really critical here, really needing the data and modeling and analysis tools to really understand the impacts of different levers, to decide, which lever to pull and how to kind of design the levers best for, the encouragement we want to see. Next slide, please. And then, of course, once the technology is commercialized and has come down the cost curve, we also need a regulatory environment that enables building and using new things. So here, folks may have seen like some kind of graph looking like this that roughly shows the technology kind of development timeline, and here roughly showing the kind of level of involvement of different players. If you can advance, I think I have at least, yes. Okay. So in, the early stages, that first circle, really where the government has a huge role to play here. There's just parts of the innovation cycle that the private sector will not invest in because there's no clear return on investment or the risk is too high. And so this is clearly a place for public policy. But we should be thinking about how to use those public policy dollars as, efficiently as possible. But here's, this is a place that really there's not really a great alternative to public dollars, and a really, really important place for the government to be spending some of their dollars. And DOE, as Kate mentioned, is doing a lot of this work, and will be really important for that to continue. So then this kind of middle circle, that's you're getting to scale up and commercial launch. Kate also mentioned some programs that DOE was pursuing, is hopefully pursuing still in some projects. That kind of lands more in this bucket, where the goal really is to catalyze private funding, because these projects are expensive and you need that kind of mix of public and private capital to do this. But certainly I think there are things to think about of how to do that most efficiently. I think there's some new things that are happening that Kate also mentioned with like insurance. And so is there a way to be even more catalytic with public funds, like inject, as little as you need to like be the thing that unlocks the rest of the capital stack, the rest of that private financing. So I think there's certainly still, work to be done there and to experiment on kind of what the best models are. But this is an area where, again, it's still quite helpful to have the government play a role here. And beyond, grants and loans and the things that DOE has done, this is where like tax credits also can play a role in this kind of scale up phase, procurement, other early adoption policies, contracts for difference, something that's is happening in Europe, but some folks are contemplating here as well. Advanced market commitments, again, something that maybe has been used in other sectors or by the private sector to really pull that demand. And portfolio standards as well, which we've seen in, say, renewable or clean electricity, actually more at the state level, has kind of functioned as this early adoption policy for things like wind and solar in their early stages. So here there's certainly a role for government, and really at all levels, federal, state, and local. And then ideally, as you get to the next, last phase here, in deployment and kind of market transformations, hopefully you can kind of start phasing out the kind of government pieces, costs has come down, and it's really, up to the market to do the rest at that point. The caveat there is that even if you no longer need government funding necessarily for the projects themselves, there are other things that the government is involved with, like regulations and how, market rules that could actually still greatly impact the deployability of some of these technologies. So actually quite a bit more for the government to do there. So this is what we call kind of policies related to non-cost barriers. And just, some examples here, Angela and Kate both mentioned electrification as one kind of cross-cutting area of technology. But for electrification, industries, need abundant, affordable, clean electricity in order to make that switch, and the electric infrastructure to really enable that. So for example, transmission, upgrades, on electricity distribution, especially if your manufacturing site was using natural gas for generating steam. Maybe you need an upgrade in order to actually bring in enough electricity that you would need to do that switch. These are the types of things that aren't necessarily the technology kind of specific costs, but become costs for the projects overall and for the success of these things. And so things that folks are thinking about now, siting and permitting reform, having transmission as part of that, reforming the interconnection queue, local and state siting and permitting. These are all things that are generally, we are going to need for increasing our clean electricity, and then therefore things that industry will need in order to electrify. Kate also mentioned infrastructure needed for some of the other cross-cutting technologies, carbon capture and storage, hydrogen. Similarly, as part of some of the siting and permitting proposals, there are pieces related to CO2 and hydrogen pipelines as well that, again, will be critical to actually enable those technologies. Then you can think about what are the rules for when you actually want to retrofit your facility or build a new facility. How can we make sure that that is not an onerous process while still delivering real benefits to the communities that those facilities are in? And then a final example that I always like to share with people, codes and standards, boring but important, and just in particular for cement and concrete. The way that concrete is used now are largely prescriptive specifications. You can think of this like a recipe. You're told exactly how much water, how much cement, how much aggregate, and other things to mix into your concrete. And that's really limiting to innovation of these new materials. And so there's efforts to change this from a prescriptive specification to performance specification, where instead you would say, well, I want it to be at this strength. I want it to do this and this and this. And you have those performance characteristics. And then you can innovate and design, lower carbon mixes and use lower carbon options to fulfill the same performance. But that's really a switch that has to be made in order for some of these materials, even if they get cheap enough, that's a barrier for them to deployment. So lastly, we need to create just an overall kind of policy and business environment that encourages global and domestic investments. Angela mentioned the EU CBAM. This is really important, for maintaining American competitiveness domestically in an increasingly global market, but also having those additional export markets potentially as we continue to innovate and become more clean. So that could be, a really important lever there. We can also think about other US specific institutions that have an international remit. How can they play a bigger role in that technology transfer from the US to emerging economies, things like the Development Finance Corporation or Export-Import Bank. And then finally, again, on the data and and modeling and analysis. These, again, are quite important, both for helping companies make decisions on what investments they really want to make, but also for compliance with certain policies, like the EU CBAM or the 45Q, tax credit for carbon capture, and showing that you meet the requirements to receive that credit. Things like the GHG reporting program was a critical piece to both of those, policies. And so taking a look at, trying to continue to support the government really being involved in these types of things. And then I think I'm at my final slide, and I'll wrap up quickly. Here, just quickly, I'm coming for philanthropy. Philanthropy certainly has a role to play, and here are just some examples that Kate, I think, has already mentioned several of these: the insurance, new product Trellis, and Greenie Re. Green Market Activation has been working with other NGOs and companies on figuring out environmental attribute certificates to really enable transactions of these lower carbon materials. And then at the very bottom, there's a whole battle going on now on carbon accounting and corporate accounting and disclosure. And this is a lot of what companies are using to also make their decisions. And so we're really interested in seeing, this play out in a way that really encourages companies to make investments into emissions reductions technologies. So like I said, there's certainly places for philanthropy and potentially for, replacing some limited, funding on some of these projects, but there's really not enough funding, not enough weight to replace an effective federal government. There's just such a critical role for the federal government to play in this space, both on the funding side, but again, on the non-funding and kind of the non-cost barriers as well, on regulation, on codes and standards. That's really a place that there's no replacement for federal policy. So I will leave it at that and hand it back over to Dan.
Great. Thanks, Abigail. So first off, you are in the lead. You've mentioned codes and standards. That's something we keep track of. It's a great topic and also a great policy that's underappreciated. So you're ahead in the brownie points department as of now, but there's still a chance for Angela and Kate to catch up. So keeping an eye on our Q&A, couple questions that I'd like to lead off with. And Angela, maybe this is something that we could start with you and then hear from Kate and Abigail as well. Abigail, you just mentioned that we're really talking about a lot of, we say industrial sector, but that covers a lot of stuff. And it's all stuff that we absolutely have to maintain our economy and maintain our way of life. It's plastics, it's cement, it's steel, but it's also things like we haven't talked much about today, like food and beverages, it's paper products. It's a lot of stuff count. And so I'm curious, like, appreciating that each one of those sort of, sectors, food and beverage is very different than cement, I would assume. But what are the through lines? Like, what are the commonalities as we're thinking about the industrial sector taken as a whole? Are there some overarching themes that policymakers should be thinking about? And maybe this builds off what Abigail was just talking about. But Angela, I'm curious what your thoughts about overarching themes.
Yeah, I think one essential piece of this is making clean, firm power available to industry across the, of all sizes and needs. Where Abigail left some of the infrastructure piece of the ability to have a grid that can deliver clean, firm power and get it to those factories, be they, no matter what they make. So I would say that's one big one. I think the other thing is electrification. Things like boilers are a little easier to electrify than some other aspects of industry, and other industries have been, I think, investing in energy efficiency, and I think that's another place that is going to continue to be beneficial. The continuous improvement needed to use energy more wisely and less. And the last thing I would just say is, when I think about food and beverage, one of the things that we don't think about as much is the refrigeration part of that, and what are the technologies and what are the lower carbon ways we can implement or support refrigeration technologies.
Thanks. And Kate, I'm interested in what you had to say. You work specifically on industrial decarbonization and long duration energy storage, but when you look at across the industrial sector, what do you see as kind of common themes that policymakers should be thinking about?
Yeah, just to double click on Angela's first point, I mean, I clapped, but the aluminum sector is a good example of what happens when you can't get um, power at the right price to an industrial facility. So we used to be one of the leading producers of aluminum in the world because we had access to great low cost hydropower that was also clean. So those now, as we've continued in many ways to get efficient, we haven't built as much generation, and those facilities have not had the same access to the low cost power and long term power agreements that they used to have. And so we've closed, and now we have about 5 operating in the United States today. So down from nearly, I think, 20 in the turn of the century. So I would just say that's really critical. And then actually being able to move those electrons. We saw a lot of electrification plays in the food and beverage space. They were also really compelling because they were what we called replicable. You could move them between facilities. You could do it once. As I said, you want to do things the first time once. You don't want to be changing it every implementation. And food and beverage was an area we saw those e-boiler systems, the heat pump systems. You could learn how to do it once at your facility and then move it. And that still relies, though, on being able to get low-cost power into that new system. So I would say that the one thing I'll add is across all of these, the way to think about proposals I found is to be a bit of a nerd, the thermodynamics of what is being proposed. So it's a good way if the energy required is going down or is being used more efficiently, the new process is actually going to be more cheap most of the time in the long run. And so that's a way that we were able to think about the DOE. Could we see a world where this becomes cheaper in the long run because it is a more efficient, what we would call thermodynamically efficient process? So not that every lawmaker is going to think about it that way, but asking that question, you can start to see, have the innovators thought about that?
And Abigail, from your perch in philanthropy, what do you see common? You were kind of talking about this towards the end of your presentation, but I'll give you an opportunity to double click on things that Angela or Kate might have just said.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the clean electricity, clean firm power, so important there, and so can't agree more with all of that. Maybe just a quick example of like an exciting development in that area. Thermal energy storage is a technology that can be applied across a lot of these industrial sectors. It's really process heat is kind of the bucket of emissions that we're trying to get at in a lot of these sectors. And so this is an exciting technology that can take, electricity in, heat up their storage media to sometimes very, very high temperatures, and then deliver, that heat into the process rather than using natural gas for, boiler or for generating steam, which is what a lot of these industrial facilities do. And last week, Rondo Energy, which is a thermal battery company, announce, I think, their first like commercial operation or like the biggest commercial operation of their heat battery in California that is replacing a natural gas kind of steam process just alongside an existing facility. And so that was really exciting. And I think, we hope to see more of those types of announcements in different areas.
That's awesome. We're coming to the end of our time today, but maybe it's just because we're all at EESI, we're starting to think internationally. We're mostly domestic focused, but it's Coptober, it's almost Copvember. We're ready to go. Kate, maybe we could start with you and then give Angela an opportunity to weigh in, and then Abigail give her the last word today. Is there anything you would like to add about international competitiveness? Whether that's something that we could be doing better here to make our industry more competitive, or maybe something that is being done abroad that is putting another country at a competitive advantage compared to one of the industries that maybe we're most known for. So we'll treat this as a lightning round because we don't want to keep people too much past 10 o'clock.
Yeah, I'll just say, I think funding the R&D on the next generation of technologies and then pairing that with support to commercialize, sort of going all the way along that spectrum Abigail showed, is critical. This was maybe a carrot or a Easter egg. I did my master's in China. And so the place that I saw, and we're seeing the results of really targeted long-term policy on, they would fund huge numbers of EV companies and they would lose money from the government side in order to then eventually become the leader in the world. And so what we're seeing, I think, we can develop technologies here. We need to continue to support them so that we can lead when we invent them into the future.
Angela, to you, lightning round, something international flavored that you'd like to mention? You're muted. Sorry, Angela.
I mean, just as I said, I think the world continues to move forward. I think there are some changes within industries, and you see industries doing their own roadmaps for how they're going to decarbonize. I think once you get to that point, you really do have kind of a global phenomenon, and I think that's what we're seeing in at least some industries. And so, for the U.S. to remain competitive, they're going to need to keep up with their with their counterparts in their sector.
And Abigail, I think this gives you the last word today. Do you have any thoughts about sort of international competitiveness?
Yeah, I'd say just to add on to what Kate and Angela have already said, some of the things that I've heard with companies' perspectives that has been, not great to hear is just how much they're kind of leaving the US, pursuing opportunities in other countries because there are, policies in place because for, other reasons, it's more attractive to be doing these types of projects in other places. And so I think, we need to kind of right the ship a little bit before too much of that happens, before we are, losing, like Kate said, our innovation that really started here ends up going elsewhere. And, the types of policies that we've talked about today are some ways to really kind of bring some of that back and keep this, really world-class innovation in the US, but then with still that global impact down the road.
I imagine once you build a facility, put all of that, you're going to have it for a while. Once it leaves, maybe it takes a couple decades for it to even be considered to be relocated. Angela and Kate and Abigail, thank you so much for your excellent presentations today. As a reminder, folks in our audience can go back and rewatch the presentations today. You can also visit us at eesi.org and download all the slides. There's some great slides that were presented today, but thank you so much for joining us to talk about this incredibly interesting topic. We're going to go ahead and wrap it up. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Dan O, Amory, Allison, Hannah, Anna, Nicole, Laura, and Miguel for all of the work that they put into this program today, as well as all of our briefings. In general, a lot of other briefings that we've got either coming up or have already done this year or in past years have been mentioned too, and I don't really do any of it. It's all of them. So thank you so much for all of that effort. We also happen to have two incredible interns this semester, Haley and Olivia. So thank you very much for all of your contributions. And behind the scenes is Troy, our videographer. Thank you, Troy, for everything you do for us as well. We hope to see you online on October 30th for our FEMA Rapid Readout. That's going to be a really good one. Great way to keep up with what's happening on a bipartisan basis in the House of Representatives around FEMA reform and just, understanding what's happening with the agency in general. And then we have 3 successive briefings, November 4th, 5th, and 6th, and that will represent our kickoff of our intensive coverage of COP30 in Brazil. And we've got more stuff coming up in December, and we're even planning into the first quarter of next year already. Some great briefings are in the works. Thank you so much. There's a survey link or a QR code on the screen right now. If you have a minute or two to take our survey to let us know how we did, whether you had any issues with the feed, the audio, the visual, anything like that, or if you have ideas for future topics, please let us know. And lastly, just one last plug for Climate Change Solutions. Our latest issue came out yesterday. If you subscribe, it was a great way to keep up with all of our briefings and all of the other stuff that we've been doing. We've been doing lots of great articles on topics like data centers and water consumption. We've got all sorts of additional COP resources, COP30 resources coming out too over the next few weeks, and signing up at EESI.org for climate change solutions. That's the best way. Happy Wednesday to everyone. Thank you for hanging with us and being online with us today. And again, Angela, Kate, and Abigail, thanks for being tremendous panelists. And we'll see you next Thursday for our rapid readout about FEMA. Have a great Wednesday, everyone. Thanks.